All right, now we are live to the world. Hooray! For those of you that are interested in sharing the live link, Soraya can actually make, I'm going to grab the link here so you guys can share it wherever you're interested. I'll throw it into the chat. And we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome to our CleanStart Perspectives this morning. I'm Thomas Hall, Executive Director of CleanStart, and I'm located here at Hacker Lab, where we still have our COVID things in order. That's why you see me with a mask on. Can everyone hear me all right? I just want to check that. Everyone can hear me? I'm seeing nods. Excellent. That's good. All right, so welcome to CleanStart's Perspectives with Mark Trexler, climate knowledge photographer of the Climatographers. He's going to have to correct me on that. But first, I also want to recognize CSU Sacramento Resources for Entrepreneurship. If you have a startup that you want to get support for, reach out to the Carlson Center or to the College of Engineering and Computer Science. If you're looking at doing projects with students, Kayvon Shafizada, Assistant Dean of Student Affairs and Interim Dean of the College of Engineering and Computer Science, and for working with professors, Professor Jawa, Assistant Dean of Faculty Affairs. Connect with them. They're great resources in the community here. Additionally, we are sponsored by SMUD, Weintraub Tobin, Sac State, Blue Tech Valley, and my first cup of coffee, or first six sometimes, is sponsored by PIM Motion. They're collaborating with the California Mobility Center out down there in Sacramento. Some quick announcements. We have a clean tech meetup tomorrow where we're focusing on startups. We have a solar side chat with Michelle Halston of GT Law. It's always a great way to connect with her and her decades of experience in working with startups and helping them accelerate. Additionally, today there's the Venture Catalyst with helping scaling benefits, and also the Carlson Center and Startup Stack have their happy hour tonight. There's a whole bunch of links in here. I encourage you to jump in there, click on them, connect with them, stay active. That's how you're going to stay on top of a lot of these things. And with that, I would like to welcome Mark Trexler of the Climatographers. Please take it away. Go ahead, Gary.
Mark, welcome, and thanks for doing this morning. Many things going on in the world of carbon reduction and what the science has improved over the years. I thought it would be good to just get your perspectives on what's going on. I see more and more companies making pledges to reduce carbon footprint and taking action to acquire offsets. I see markets maturing for carbon offsets. For the first time, the BGC market information on California has shown a ton of carbon dioxide has gone above $20. It had been hovering below that, $18, $19 for a long time. Europe is different. But generally, the community that we're dealing with is a lot of people have clever ideas. They really want to support sustainability. They really want to be able also to capture the value that their contribution to reducing carbon footprints provide. And you're on top of all this stuff. So what are the hot topics here and what's going on in people's responses to global climate change?
Well, thanks for having me on, Gary. There is a lot going on. I did the first carbon offset project 33 years ago. Hard to believe, and at the time, nobody working on carbon offsets thought we would still be dealing with carbon offsets today. The electric utilities back then in the early 90s, when I was doing management consulting with them, the electric utilities, they anticipated we would have national climate policy by the mid 1990s. And so they were interested in offsets as a way of making their compliance with policy more cost effective. We've obviously never seen that that policy materialize. So carbon offsets have sort of stayed in the game. They were fading out about 5 years ago. People were losing interest in them. And then suddenly this whole net zero term came up and companies started saying, hey, the world needs to be net zero, so we're going to be net zero. And the only way for them to be net zero is by buying a lot of offsets. And so suddenly offsets are all the rage again. And that's not necessarily a good thing, because if a lot of the offsets aren't great offsets and a lot of the offsets are not great offsets, then there's a lot of distracting going on, and it actually potentially undercuts efforts to achieve systemic change. And I think it's worth just pointing out that I did a lot of the first carbon footprints 30 years ago, and in retrospect, I apologize for sort of helping get that going when I was at the World Resources Institute, because we really are overly focused on carbon footprints today. Because what we need is systemic change in the economy and the energy sector, and each of us focusing on our personal or organizational carbon footprint is by no means what is sort of most valuable for bringing about systemic change. And so there's a problem here with an over focus on footprints and a bit of an over focus on offsets. But they are huge. People are talking about increasing offset markets 100-fold. Mark Carney's task force on voluntary markets. The finance people are getting involved. People are seeing billions of dollars sort of coming into these things. The real question is, will it actually do anything to help mitigate climate change? And we don't know that, because we've done a pretty poor job with offsets in the past. The additionality issue has been sort of the Achilles heel of offsets. And if we don't do a better job going forward, then we're going to look back at this as a sort of just a disaster in the making. From the standpoint of people wanting to do interesting things, it's been really tough for offsets to really play a factor in that, because offset prices have been so low, at $1, at $5, at $10. And people tend to buy offsets 1 year at a time. So nobody goes out and signs a 20-year offset contract at $100 a ton, which really could make a big difference to a startup's finances potentially. But if everything is year by year for just a couple of dollars, then it's very hard to rely on carbon offset funding as part of a business model or a business plan. And that's been a real challenge for seeing carbon offset sort of help launch new ideas and help launch innovation. It's been really difficult. And let me stop there for now.
Well, additionality, which I presume is the whole issue of whether what you've done is actually a net contribution over what would have happened anyway. That's a big one. And I think people have tried to come up with ways to certify CO2 reduction. Is that what you meant by the problem with additionality?
Yeah, the best definition of additionality of an additional project or an additional ton is that it's traceable back to the fact that the carbon market exists and that a market for those offsets exists. So in other words, does the fact that a market for offsets is the reason that you're doing something and that it's reducing emissions or sequestering carbon? Because if you're doing something regardless of whether the carbon market exists, then you're not actually changing. The atmosphere isn't seeing any change. So if you go out and say, hey, I'm going to reward everybody that bought a Prius or a Tesla and give them carbon credits, if somebody bought a Prius or a Tesla because of the carbon market and because of an incentive created by the carbon market, that would be additional. But for $10, $20, that's not going to actually influence anybody's decision on buying a Tesla. But if you go and start giving carbon offset credits to everybody that has a Tesla, then basically 99.9% of the offsets aren't legitimate. They're not additional. They're not being caused by the existence of the carbon market. And it's been, that issue has been really hard to nail down, and a lot of the standards don't do a good job of nailing it down. And so estimates of sort of false offsets range to 80% of the market in some cases.
Oh my. Well, then that's a big problem. And I mean, there are people out there that talk about certifying your CO2 offsets as legitimate. Certainly the ARB in California tries to have some kind of structure around that. But what I take from what you're saying is, by and large, those are not working very well. Is that true?
Well, the challenge is, and to take the ARB, there's a very interesting story. ProPublica just came out with a big story about 2 weeks ago, looking at the California forestry protocol and some very interesting analysis that a team at Berkeley and elsewhere has been doing to try and figure out, are these projects additional? Because what they do in that case is they come up with a protocol and they say, if you match this protocol, if you have more carbon than average on your land, then you might be able to get carbon offsets. And the problem is that a lot of people have more carbon than average on their land just because they do. That's the way they've been managing their land. And so ProPublica or not ProPublica, but the study said that 20 to 30 million tons of offset certified under that protocol in California were not additional, and so were illegitimate offsets. And there's no way to know for sure. It's testing for additionality. A weird example that I use is it's like, imagine trying to design a test for pregnancy if you never were able to determine whether the woman was pregnant. So because additionality, would you have done it anyway? There's no way to ever know whether someone would have or wouldn't have done it anyway, because it's a counterfactual. As soon as you make a decision, you're stuck with it. So it's imagine designing a pregnancy kit if you never knew whether a baby had been born. It would be really tough. And that's the challenge that we have with additionality. And it's been a really difficult problem to overcome, and carbon markets have really suffered for it.
Well, let's take the other extreme. Companies like Carbon Engineering, show pictures of the big mega structure with all the fans on it and everything, and they are literally stripping CO2 out of the air. That would seem to be clearly additional.
Well,
I'm not sure whether it's economic, but
right. Well, the best offset right now, if you want to do something that is rock solid, literally, so to speak, you can buy offsets from Climeworks project that injects CO2 into granite formations in Iceland, and it literally turns the CO2 into rock. And if you're willing to pay $750 a ton for your offset, you can get a great offset. Most people aren't willing to pay more than $5 a ton, so that you can see where the gap comes in. But yes, there are certainly plenty of things that are additional, but they tend to be a lot more expensive than others. And as long as you've got lousy quality stuff that can call itself an offset, it's really tough for the good projects to differentiate themselves, because people will gravitate towards the cheapest thing they can find that's called an offset.
There's an interesting question that somebody just put up. Where does offsets and fire prevention intersect? Because fire prevention would seem to be a carbon reduction in some sense.
Yeah, there was an effort to actually do offset projects around fire prevention about 15 years ago. It's challenging. I mean, clearly, does it make sense from a climate mitigation perspective to do fire prevention and fire management? Absolutely. Is that a good use of mitigation funding? Yes. Doing it for offsets, though, when it's so unpredictable exactly what's going on, it didn't catch on, and it poses that's sort of an interesting example of trying to do with a voluntary market, in other words, offsets market, something that really ought to simply be done with other funding sources. You're putting a bit of a round peg into a square hole in trying to bring together something like fire prevention with something like offsets.
What are examples of terrible offsets? And let's take an example. You've got a solar PV company. Yes, people are putting solar PV on their rooftops. Maybe they would be incentivized a little bit more to put more on. But how would a PV company legitimately use carbon offsets, and would it make any difference? Just as an example of one of these gray areas.
Well, and let me step back from PV for a second and focus on another energy in terms of, because one of the biggest problems in this space has been renewable energy credits being sold as offsets. Millions and millions and millions of tons of megawatt hours, tons, however you want to talk about it, of voluntary renewable energy certificates have been sold into carbon offset markets. There is no evidence whatsoever that those carbon offset markets have caused any new wind to be built anywhere. And there's no way it would, because the amount of money involved just is so small that it would be irrelevant to the financing of a wind project. And so, yeah, that's a real thing that has occurred and has been a real problem. PV is a bit of a different case, just because in theory, it's the same kind of thing. In theory, if I were willing to pay $100 for a carbon offset, and I was willing to sign a 10-year contract to pay $100 every year for my carbon offset, that, a PV company might be able to really take that to the bank in some way in making something happen that otherwise wouldn't have happened. But if I'm willing to pay $5 for an offset, and I'm only willing to sign a 1-year contract, so to speak, no long-term contracts, then it's almost impossible to see how that PV company uses offsets in a legitimate way. Can they sell, quote unquote, sell stuff, offsets from panels that they already have in place? Yeah, but they're not really additional. They're not contributing any environmental benefit to that at that point. They're already there. So for sort of high tech stuff, that's what I was mentioning earlier. If these markets were operating very differently, much higher prices, much longer term contracts, it would be a lot easier to see how high tech could take advantage of offset markets. But the way markets have evolved, very low prices and year by year stuff, it's just very difficult to do anything with that in terms of taking it to the bank to expand your company or to do something along those lines.
Well, but being more of a merchant-driven thing here, if you can put together projects installing PV, and you can legitimately participate in offset markets and maybe get $5 a ton for what you've offset, from a business perspective, why wouldn't you do that? I mean, is that something that's possible?
Oh, a lot of people do it. A lot of people do it, and basically, even though they may understand that it's not actually having any environmental benefit, but they figure, well, it's out there, somebody's going to take that money, I might as well take that money. And but what that then means is that we've ended up in this race to the bottom, where that's why people are buying $1 renewable energy certificates or $5 offsets, as opposed to having the expectation that they should be paying $50 or $60 or $70. $50, $60, $70 might really make a difference to that company that you're talking about. $5 is just chump change, so to speak. And so that's what's happening with a lot of offsets today, is that people are simply taking advantage of the market, but it's not really driving anything new. They can't install any new panels with offset revenues, generally speaking. It's just not big enough money.
Is it different in Europe? Prices are for offsets are different there.
Well, yeah, you have to remember that the carbon price in Europe is an allowance price in terms of, and it got north of $50, which is quite remarkable. It was, it was at $1 a couple of years ago. And so that's not really the offset price per se. It's the allowance price, sort of the same in California. And so there's some offsets can come into the system, but what people are paying for offsets isn't necessarily the same as the allowance price, the market clearing allowance price. And how offsets will evolve now within the European trading system, it will be interesting to see. Most of the offset markets were under the Kyoto Protocol. That's gone away, and so what comes next is still a little bit unclear. But it certainly could. A carbon market at $50 opens a lot more possibilities than a carbon market at 10.
Yes. And I mean, I'm not sure I understand the difference between an allowances type market and an offset market. And I don't even know how to characterize the California market. I mean, they're selling basically what I thought were allowances. So what's the difference in Europe? Why are they $50?
Well, basically, in an allowance, there are several kinds of markets here. But in an allowance market, you hand everybody allowances, and they have to turn in enough allowances at the end of the year to cover their emissions. So if they have more than they need, they can sell those allowances to somebody else. Somebody else can buy those allowances. But that offsets aren't inherently involved there at all. It's just you're trading the allowances. If the allowance price gets high enough, people will find ways to reduce their emissions, so they don't need as many allowances, so they can sell allowances to somebody else. But an offset is when you're bringing an emission reduction into the system from somewhere else. You're going to Brazil and planting a forest, and you're counting that against your emissions. You're printing allowances in a sense, because you're allowed to do an offset somewhere else that you can substitute for having to turn in an allowance that was given to you by the state. And so very different systems. If you allow enough offsets, you can totally undermine the environmental integrity of the allowance system. If you let in, so in California, there has always been a very strict limit on what fraction of your compliance can come from offsets, as opposed to having to come from allowances.
Well, also in California, we have the low carbon fuel standard.
Mm-hmm.
And very elaborate table ranking various fuels by some measure of their carbon footprint. And people are blending fuels in order to meet the low carbon fuel standard, et cetera. Is that market contributing something? Is it different than the offsets? How does the low carbon fuel standard market, if you're familiar with it, doing in California, and how much different is it than what we've been talking about?
Well, it's another market mechanism. So it's not offsets per se. And it's been a few years since I really tracked what was going on with the LCFS in California. All of those systems, you have to look extremely carefully at how the numbers are put together and what's going on, and where is the ethanol coming from, and is it coming from corn in the Midwest, or is locally? There is no simple answer to the environmental effectiveness of low carbon fuels standards. You can find analyses that suggest an impact. You can find analyses that suggest it's almost irrelevant. It's certainly more effective would be a higher price on gasoline and on fuels. Putting a carbon price on those things would almost certainly be more effective, because the way that I like to put it is, whenever we come up with these policies, the policymakers consistently forget that there are 1,000 people in the room next door, very smart people, whose sole mission in life is to game whatever the rules are that you just wrote. And that's a huge challenge, because anytime you write these complex rules, can people game them? And very often they can. And so then you've got problems. So there's no simple answer to that, but it's just one more market mechanism that a number of states are playing with. As you know, as opposed to putting in a high gas tax, it's something that's been pushed very hard by the ethanol industry, because then it opens up huge markets for them. And the end result, environmental integrity, is not always clear for these systems. There was a question that I just wanted to, I think, from I guess Sacramento EV. How do utility programs for green electricity? And I think this is worth pointing out. I'm not familiar with exactly how SMUD's system works, but a lot of the green electricity programs around the country have simply been based on buying and selling these renewable energy certificates. So you'll go to a big, huge wind farm in Texas, and you'll buy these, you'll unbundle the renewable attributes from the electricity. You'll buy them for $1 a megawatt hour. You'll bring them back and sell them to your customers at $10 a megawatt hour. And so, a lot of these programs have had very significant profit margins for no environmental benefit. Not all of them. And I'm not saying that's the SMUD program, but it's been a big problem in a lot of the green energy programs, is just buying and selling a commodity that doesn't have any environmental value and claiming that it does.
Yeah, I don't know the details of the green energy program, and there are people in the mix here that probably work on that. But mostly it's been, you can choose 100% renewable.
Right.
And
for $5 a month.
Yeah, it comes down to, is that really, a piece of SMUD's wind farm in the Sacramento Delta, or is it something they bought from somebody else and transferred in the way you're talking about? I don't know the answer to that question, right. But yeah, it's a popular thing to do. So, carbon taxes always been controversial. Yes, it may be a more secure way of achieving the objective, but I guess politically, people just don't like to talk about increasing the price of gasoline, particularly now that it's gone up quite significantly in the last 6 months. So what else is on the horizon? The carbon markets haven't turned out so great and actually having an effect. Except for a few things, injecting it into granite, extracting it from the atmosphere. Well, what else is going on? Let me just get specific on this question. We've got an interesting company in town that takes CO2 that they strip out of power plant exhausts and hydrogen that they buy on the market, and they can make that back into a clean diesel fuel. That takes a certain number of barrels of crude oil that you otherwise would have produced and leaves them in the ground. Is that a good carbon offset strategy or carbon reduction strategy?
Well, there are lots of sort of those technologies, air to fuel technologies being explored out there that potentially they could be climate game changers. The real challenge is how do you bring those technologies to market without a carbon price, or without a hefty carbon price? If we had a carbon price of $100 a ton, the equivalent of $1 a gallon of gasoline, we would be seeing a lot more innovation in this space. But the fact that these technologies have to compete with gasoline prices as they are, so to speak, and diesel prices as they are, is a huge burden for them. But they're absolutely the kinds of technologies that we need to lead to systemic change in the transport sector. But what's going to drive that? It up to this point, it hasn't been carbon markets, and the question is, what other ways, what other forms of technology innovation policy can we come up with that might work? And that gets into the whole climate finance arena, separate from carbon offsets, and lots of money is going into a lot of those companies. And they're making a bet that that at some point we will see real climate policy in the U.S., which we really haven't seen yet. But there's a lot of money being bet on the fact that the U.S. will actually try to reduce its emissions by 50% by 2030, which is a heavy lift. and it's going to require all sorts of stuff that isn't happening today. I think that the metaphor I use, which I think we ought to be using more often, is the idea of climate chess, because there are hundreds of pieces on this climate chessboard. And I think of climate change as or climate chess as the ultimate planetary board game. And you can actually, if you go to climatechess.climatesites.net, you'll see a website specifically on climate chess. I'll put that into the chat. But there are lots of things, whether technology innovation, whether human behavior, whether just getting people to talk to other people about climate change at the Thanksgiving table. There are lots of things that we ought to be doing for climate change. We tend to be looking for silver bullets, and we tend to look for silver bullets or silver buckshot, and then we argue about which silver bullet is better than another silver bullet. And to bring about the systemic change that's required in all of these spaces, we need to be doing lots of different things, and that's hard to get our heads around. So we tend to argue about which is the most important.
And I encourage anybody who has a question to put them in the chat so we can pick them up here. But okay, so everybody's pledging to reduce carbon emissions 50% by some date in the future. I mean, is the accounting good enough to know whether we ever know whether we're reducing and hitting that level, or is that pretty much a game of how you set up the rules and how you do the calculations?
Well, a lot of people would argue that it's nothing but greenwashing. A lot of people would argue that it's greenwashing. So instead of doing something today, you say I'll accomplish something by 2050. I think in a lot of cases, this is a term that was invented last year, and I love the term green wishing. I think there's an awful lot of green wishing going on that doesn't live up to greenwashing, but it's also not necessarily particularly likely to mitigate climate change. The biggest problem with a lot of what's going on today is that you'll have a company saying we're going to be net zero, but then you'll ask them, well, how are you lobbying for public policy on climate change at the state level and federal level? And their answer is, well, we don't do that. And yet, without policy, none of these other things ultimately, they make a difference. They can show the way, but if 5% of early adopters do these things, that's not going to solve climate change. And so you've got to combine all of these different things and technology innovation. You've got to combine it with public policy. And yet the corporate community has been largely absent from the policy advocacy table when it comes to climate change. And in many cases, there are a lot of studies out there, a lot of the trade associations, companies are waving the climate flag on the one hand, and their trade associations are killing climate policy in a back room. So there really should be a lot more attention to what companies are saying and doing on the policy level than worrying too much about commitments they're making 20 years out into the future.
Well, I guess ultimately, whether or not we achieve these goals, they're being phrased in terms of a reduction in parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere. That's measurable. That's something, that either happens or it doesn't happen. Unfortunately, it's a lagging indicator, and I don't know how many years it takes for, action in year one to actually achieve some amount of carbon reduction in year X. One would think that with the lockdowns of the pandemic and the reduction in economic activity, you would be seeing some dip in the carbon content of the atmosphere, at least a slowdown of the increase. I haven't seen it. Of course, the data takes a long time to come together. Well, are we going to only know if things were effective 10 years after the fact?
Well, we have instantaneous tracking of these things. I mean, literally. And so there was a very modest dip associated with the pandemic. But we're already blowing past that dip now as things come back. And so the increase has been pretty inexorable up to this point. The point you're making, I think, fits into the policy thing here, is that unless to see a real change in what's happening in the atmosphere, you're talking about having to swing, billions and billions and billions of tons of emissions. You're not talking about a few 100 million tons of carbon offsets. That's not going to show up in a big way in the atmosphere. We need to be revolutionizing the electric sector, revolutionizing the transport sector, and that's going to call for policy.
So to get back, okay, I don't know what kind of volume of offsets are being traded. If it's the 100 million tons a year, that's just a drop in the bucket. But to take it from the perspective again of you're a small startup, if you wanted to sell your carbon reduction benefits, is it a lot of paperwork? Is it a lot of bureaucracy trying to get all that done? And you would just say, it's not worth it. I understand if the offsets are $5, $10, or even $20, it's not a whole lot of money, but somebody wants to do it. What's the process like?
Yeah, and you have to get, in most cases, you have to get your project certified by one of the validators that's out there, and you do have to go through a process that can, for a small outfit, can be costly and take time. So you might spend $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 on getting your project sort of up and running, and then at $5 a ton, it may take you a while to make that money back. But there are a bunch of there's a whole industry now out there that's now buying and selling these things. Pretty easy to find. The brokers, there are 4 or 5 standards that you can go to get your project approved, so you can get it stamped as a certified thing, which doesn't mean it's a good offset, because a lot of these standards are a bit dodgy. But that's what people do. And so it's not particularly difficult. I do think something to be a bit careful of is, right now we're talking about massively increasing voluntary carbon markets. The task force on Mark Carney out of the UK's task force on voluntary carbon markets, they're talking about increasing them into the billions of tons. If that happens, my suspicion is that most of the players in today's carbon offset markets will be wiped out, because all the smaller offset players just aren't going to be able to play in a market where you're trading million-ton blocks of carbon. So we really could have a situation where lots of good things that are small scale get wiped out as we transition to this mega finance sector driven carbon offset market.
So tell me more about that, because Nick Sokol has asked a version of this question, where offset markets fall on a ranking among other ways to achieve carbon neutrality. The finance market. So what are you saying there? It's by financing specific projects, or companies, technologies? What is the finance angle that you're talking about?
The finance market in this case is the finance sector seeing if the voluntary market for carbon offsets can be increased 100-fold, which is what some people are talking about, into 10 billion tons a year, then they see a profit opportunity there. And so a lot of stuff that probably would have happened anyway suddenly gets packaged up as carbon offsets and starts getting sold. But if you're doing it in million-ton blocks, people with 1,000 tons a year to sell into that market are going to have a lot of problems competing in that market. So it's just a bit of a risk when the finance sector starts seeing dollar signs for carbon offsets, because it's just easy to see how it takes off and the environmental benefit gets left behind, because people are making money. The topic of climate finance, separate from offsets, but the whole issue of, is the finance sector going to stop funding coal plants around the world, which seems to be happening. Or will the finance sector, change how it thinks about risk so that various climate technologies get preferential treatment? There's a huge amount that can be done there. Again, it would be a lot easier if we rejiggered the economic system so that we had a carbon price to drive a lot of this stuff. Without it, it's a lot harder to see how it happens. But it has been just politically, as you noted, politically almost impossible to get a material carbon price into the system.
Exactly. Well, I knew you'd be the right guy to ask. I don't know that you've got the most positive message out there, but it's factual. And so appreciate you joining us this morning. And we may bring you back because there'll be developments in this area, and there may be some follow-up questions. But I want to give you a round of applause. Everybody, thank Mark for the time this morning, and you've been very helpful.
And in terms of that, the Nick question, just very quickly, up to this point, offset markets have not really helped at all in terms of the shift to a carbon neutral or carbon negative society. And if we're going to have carbon offsets, we should make sure that they are making that contribution. Up to this point, they really haven't been, and so a lot of people see them as more of a distraction than not, as we're trying to make that shift to carbon negative.
All right. Well, again, thank you very much, and we look forward to talking to you again in the future. We'll put it out there a few months, maybe a year off, and see what's happening. But I have no idea what razor clams are and why anybody would want to go out and dig them.
They are the delicacy of the world.
Okay.
Okay.
So, I barely know what a gooey duck is. Now I got to figure out what a razor clam is.
Yep. Yeah. Okay.
So let me turn
thanks,
it back
Gary.
to Thomas for the wrap up here.
Yep.
All right. Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you very much, Mark, for coming and talking with us today at our CleanStart Perspectives. Thank you, everyone, for attending. Make sure that you stay connected with us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube. An edited version of this will be up on YouTube. And join us tomorrow for our Clean Tech Meetup. We're going to be focusing on startups that have gotten funding recently. And join us next week for our Solar Side Chat with Michelle Halston. Additional thanks to our overall program sponsors, Hacker Lab Momentum, Reverent, and Greenberg Traurig, and our community of partners. Thank you all for joining us today, and look forward to seeing you guys in the future.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks so much. And Dave Tamayo says razor clams are wonderful. So I'll have to ask him that when I see him.
There you
Why?
go. Okay.